Next speaker is Courtland McEneny Ingraham of the George Washington University, presenting Establishing an Institution as Perfect as Possible in its Formation, John Jay's Extrajudicial Activities and Their Impact on the Supreme Court. Thank you, Cody.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the APHI and especially to Henry and Cole for organizing this today. To my fellow panelists and to Greg, this is a bit of an undergrad reunion. We're members of the same history department, graduated together in Seattle College back then. Go Saints! And thank you to Professor Carrington Fisher for comment today. A little bit about me. My path as a historian has been a little untraditional comparatively. I'm in a dual degree program at George Washington University Law School. I received my master's in 2020, concentrated in U.S. legal history, and will be a lawyer at the end of the year by hell or high water. But today's presentation is a story about separation of powers and a nation whose government continuously faces instances of crises and catastrophes as part of the American experiment. Today's presentation is a fairly high-level paper that I wrote for a legal history seminar on the history of the Supreme Court, taught by Ethan Torrey, who's the General Counsel of the Supreme Court. Also, I think today's presentation shows that history gets written every single day. Yesterday, Senator Dick Durbin invited Chief Justice John Roberts to speak before the Senate Judiciary Committee to the ethics code which guides the U.S. Supreme Court. This comes amidst unprecedented distrust in the Supreme Court. In 2023, polls are showing that only 47% of Americans have a great deal or fair amount of trust in the federal judiciary. Only 39% of Americans approve of how the Supreme Court is handling its job. This is a stark contrast from just back in 2009, when 76% of Americans trusted the judiciary as a whole. And in similarly conducted polls supported the traditional notion that the judiciary is the most trusted branch of government, which even despite those low numbers, it is still the most trusted branch of government. That's a separate paper for another student. But I think what we saw in this episode yesterday with Chief Justice Robert and Senator Durbin is that the Chief Justice is continuously a steward of American jurisprudence and our concept of justice. It's been a role that has been tasked with keeping institutional integrity and trust in the judiciary, and this story shows how the roles of the Chief Justice has advanced over time. So I hope that in looking back to the origins of our court, we can help find clues on how to solve the court's current crises and catastrophes. John Jay was nominated to the court in 1789 at the choice of President George Washington, and his role was one with little guidance. In fact, Article 3 of the Constitution, which outlines the federal judiciary, makes no mention of a Supreme Court in the constitutional text. The only mention of the Chief Justice is actually in Article 1, which outlines our legislature by mentioning that the Chief Justice shall preside over an impeachment. That's the only mention of the Chief Justice as a role in our institution. It was presumed, scholars have presumed, that the framers drafted the Constitution with a Chief Justice in mind based on the English judicial system, and the court has been largely malleable based on congressional action. What we've seen over time is that the role of the judiciary has changed dramatically. So in my next 11 minutes, we'll go to the next slide. I'll give you a brief I've given you a brief background. Let's settle at that. But I'll briefly go over the historiography, my thesis, my analysis thus far, and we'll go to where I'm concluding right now, but where we're going to go later on, as I hope to expand this into a future project. We'll go to the next slide. Now, I thought it was interesting that John Jay's concept of separation of powers was very different than how he had executed his position on the court. Jay was not a part of the Constitutional Convention itself, as New York chose to send a small delegation to represent the state's position on representing and wanting a more limited federal government. But Jay was highly influential in getting support for ratifying the Constitution in the convention. Jay's concept of how separation of powers were to be executed was, I think, captured by this quote, that no judge of the Supreme Court of the United States shall hold any other office under the United States or any of them. This was a proposed amendment that Jay backed in effort to get the Constitution ratified in the state of New York. And going to how historiography has looked at Jay's role on the court, the adage goes that you never forget your first. However, Jay has really fallen into a category of forgotten founders when it regards his role physically as the Chief Justice. His role has been fairly shaped by several schools of historical thought, looking at the progressive school at the turn of the 20th century, which looked at the American Revolution skeptically, and this founding era skeptically, as a trend of economic gains, most quintessentially summarized in Charles Beard's An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. By the mid-20th century, consensus school historians emerged with the influence of patriotic sentiments during World War I and the Cold War, and generally showed more positive views about the judiciary and its motives. The neo-progressive school of scholars in the late 20th century became more skeptical based on things that were happening at the time: the civil rights movement, the Vietnam era, and Watergate. We're reaching that 50th anniversary of Watergate amidst our own current crises and catastrophes. And with that, there came some more skepticism around the judiciary, but not an intensive analysis of Jay and his role on the court. More recently, we've come into this genre of what H.W. Brands coined as founders chic, a series of biographies that try to humanize the founders and look at more individual narratives to unpack the individual contributions and legacies and stories of the founders. And out of that, we got Hamilton. So I think that's a pretty good contribution there. And with that, we have gotten a couple more comprehensive biographies of Jay, primarily by Walter Starr, and most recently Mark Dillon's treatment of Jay specifically as the first Chief Justice is the most recent and I think most comprehensive analysis of Jay's tenure on the court. Through my paper, what I look at are three different episodes where Jay's concept of the court in practice varies greatly from his concept of the court in theory during the ratifying conventions. Primarily, I look at how he ran for governor of New York in 1792, in how he was involved in advising the executive and was treated more as a cabinet member than as a judge, very different than our concept of what the judiciary's role with the executive is today. And lastly, the Chief Justice's role as a diplomat, physically going over to Britain during the last year of his tenure on the court to negotiate the very controversial Jay's Treaty. We can go to the next slide. Jay was nominated to the court as a friend of Washington's, but also as a champion of the Federalist agenda. So another overarching theme that's influenced my research has been looking at how Jay, in being the first Chief Justice, also was a tool that Washington used to advance his agenda with what it was. The party system is so fuzzy during that era, but looking at the Federalists generally in trying to establish a state government, something that I think our previous presentation really captured well in restoring order and here establishing order for our nation's system. Washington called Jay the keystone of our political fabric, and that's how he positioned Jay's role in how he would frame the judiciary. Jay also notably, while Washington got 69 votes, he was unanimously elected to the presidency by the Electoral College, followed by John Adams, and third was John Jay, who got 9 votes. He was definitely looked at as a very political figure at the time. We can go to the next slide, see what's there. We've gone through the historiography. We can skip over that as well. We can go a couple more. We'll go to the analysis. Let's do that. There we go. Brilliant. So first I look at 1792's gubernatorial election in New York. By actively participating in the election, Jay showed his potential for being a polarizing figure, and this was showed by Republicans who characterized him as, quote, a high aristocratic federalist who wishes the annihilation of the state governments and to absorb them into the federal union. Historian Carl Prinz characterized the Jay court as deeply compromised, both responsive and submissive to the needs and demands of the ruling Federalist Party. And on first bluff, Jay's participation emblemized this notion. Through the election, Jay was subjected to frequent attacks on his character, including being associated with, but not involved with, a stock market scandal where broker William Dewar was imprisoned for bank debts. The election resulted in scandal through contested votes, which may have resulted in Jay's victory over Clinton, George Clinton, who won that election. Jay did not contest the election's integrity, although many from both Federalist and Republican factions did, with many noted bar fights in New York City, part of the New York culture, I suppose. But ultimately, this episode of him running for governor showed that Jay was a key part in advancing Washington's partisan agenda, and as a political figure, really symbolized that. And his presence on the court did have some polarizing effect on the court. Second, I look at the advisory role of the court. One thing that Jay proffered during the ratifying convention was this view of an independent judiciary. However, Washington, to his credit, and I guess to his character, while he was not a formally educated man compared to other founders, he used that and to surround himself with highly educated people and people he felt could well advise him. And this is how he treated Jay as well. He consulted Jay as much as he consulted the other members of his cabinet, being Chief Justice and referring to the judicial department of the government. Jay really acted as a member of the cabinet in many ways, shapes, and forms. During Washington's first term, Jay advised Alexander Hamilton to ignore resolutions passed by the Virginia State Legislature, which condemned proposed legislation that would effectuate Hamilton's economic system. When Washington left the capital to tour the American South, Washington authorized his cabinet, vice president, and the Chief Justice to consult each other on continuing operation of the government. Washington appointed Jay to serve on a commission tasked with managing the national debt, an executive function. And beyond Jay, Washington utilized the justices as an intelligence gathering mechanism as they rode circuit, picture judges actually riding on horses around the country to go seek trial, to get an understanding and a finger on the pulse of what sentiments were about the nation's success. In 1793, Washington announced its proclamation of neutrality, which was a controversial policy in resisting from picking sides between Great Britain and France. At the time, Citizen Genet, who was France's ambassador to the United States, was very popular, and he was a very active figure in Philadelphia's social scene. And there was one point where Jay had a conversation about Genet and criticized Genet's intent to use his public status to influence the American polity against supporting Washington's neutrality principles. As a result, Genet actually filed a libel suit at common law against the Chief Justice, which led to another crisis and catastrophe, the question of whether the Chief Justice of the United States could actually be held liable in a civil court of law. And to make matters worse, Attorney General Edmund Randolph punted the question and wasn't Jay's biggest fan. And he waited until December 1793, left a whole summer and winter to decide, and decided to drop the charges, not without thoughtful consideration. I think what that episode represented was that this left a lot of ambiguity in the Chief Justice's role in shaping public opinion and how much he could be a part of that. As a result, Jay did end up establishing a precedent that the Chief Justice could not issue advisory opinions, and generally the judicial branch has stayed out of executive affairs. Lastly, Chief Justice Jay abandoned his role as Chief Justice to go over to France to negotiate Jay's treaty, which leads to the last issue in what the role of the Chief Justiceship has been. In that, there were no cases that could be decided by a full bench while he was over there. There was no one really administering the court, and something I have to unpack further is what the actual impact of Jay leaving the court to negotiate that treaty was. Where there were some benefits was that Jay was a celebrated diplomat. He negotiated the Treaty of Paris ending the American Revolution. That he also used his role as Chief Justice to choose mainly cases that involved foreign adversaries and parties, and really looked at his role as Chief Justice as an extension of his previous career as a diplomat. Since the Chief Justiceship has tried to stay out of extrajudicial opinions, most recently in 1986, Chief Justice Warren Burger wanted to chair the commission to celebrate the Constitution's bicentennial. The Office of Legal Counsel from the Department of Justice advised him that that would be a bad call, that would violate separation of powers, and instead of ignoring that, Warren Burger resigned to chair that bicentennial commission, which shows the real value in institutional integrity that's been seen by Jay's successors. In sum, where I'm heading with this, and we can go 2 more slides real quick, is I'm hoping to look more deeply into all 3 of these episodes and the effects that they had on perceptions of the judiciary. In understanding how Jay's mission to Great Britain affected the court's ability to hear cases and actually go through with its functions. And lastly, I hope to compare the design of the Supreme Court at the time of the framing to the design of the presidency, both fairly vaguely and broadly constructed branches of government when compared to the Congress. However, in comparison, the precedents, customs, and norms that George Washington set as president have been followed pretty strictly through today, where very few of the customs and norms that Jay set as first Chief Justice are followed today. And hopefully by looking at the ways that crises and catastrophes were handled back then, we can find some solace for today's Supreme Court.
And now I would like to turn the floor over to Professor Carrington Farmer for her comments. Oh, Professor, it seems, oh, there we go, we can hear you now. Oh, carry on, thank you.
Yeah, I think we can hear you.
Perfect. Well, I'd like to start by saying thank you so much to the conference organisers for pulling together a really brilliant conference, and my most sincere apologies that I can't be there in person. I had to make a very last minute trip to visit family in the UK, so apologies about that. I'm going to try to keep my comments brief. I'm hopefully going to talk for no more than 5 minutes, so we allow at least 10 to 15 minutes for questions. Firstly, congratulations to our 3 panelists. I really enjoyed reading your papers and hearing you speak about them. I think for us, as we listen to these 3 papers examine a wide range of crisis situations in early American history, exploring issues such as the power of individuals in different roles, state power, political power, interpersonal networks, and key things to think about such as how do we bring order in times of crisis, whether that's a moment of war or debating issues of the future of enslavement. I really enjoyed how all of the papers together wove in themes such as loyalty to states and nations at crisis moments, but also encourage us to think about political loyalties and how order then comes from moments of crisis. I have a few brief comments on each of the papers and 1 or 2 questions for our panelists to consider. So I'll take the papers in the order that we heard them. So I'll start with Armstrong's paper. I really loved how this paper connected to the conference theme, really from start to finish. I feel like Armstrong persuasively argued that, in the early 1780s, South Carolina was indeed in chaos. I really bought into that argument. And I think throughout the main body of the paper, Armstrong goes further into the theme, examining how the Jacksonboro Assembly addressed this particular crisis in the midst of the Revolutionary War in January and February of 1782. And I think most importantly, the key argument in this paper that the restoration of order, not revenge, was this particular main goal for 1782. I felt like that argument really held up throughout the paper. I also really enjoyed how Armstrong did such a deep dive with the sources, especially the letters and legal documents too. And I felt like the paper did a really strong job in engaging with the historiography. And I think this work marks a significant contribution in our reframing of the Jacksonboro Assembly. And I think, when I was reading this paper, I was really taken with how in many ways this could be seen as a micro-history, right? Like we're looking at a very short period of time and geographically at a small place too. But I felt as the paper went on, I felt like Armstrong did a really good job of tying the issues that shook this particular part of South Carolina at this particular moment into both wider and international context. And I felt like it did a really good job at tying this moment to political, legal, and military issues that connected South Carolina to what else was going on around the US, but also internationally. I think I have newspapers on my mind today, and as we'll hear with the comments I've got on the next 2 papers, I really am curious about newspapers from this period. And I was particularly interested in how one particular Massachusetts-based paper from Salem described, quote, the deplorable state of misery and confusion in South Carolina. And I just wondered how typical this assessment from Salem was in terms of opinion from the North publicly. For me, one of the most interesting parts of the paper addressed how the British occupation led to a particular crisis in the world of a particular group of people, the white elite men who governed over South Carolina. And on page 4, Armstrong writes, quote, perhaps worst of all, or at least in the eyes of white elites from the Low Country, a sizable number of enslaved peoples, free black people, Indians, and backcountry poor had started to exercise more agency in the months following the British occupation of Charlestown. And again, I think this bit of the paper really raises some of the difficult questions that historians of this period have to consider. As the paper notes, slavery was indeed the backbone of colonial South Carolina, and it permeated every aspect of society through cultures of power. And I'd love to hear you speak a little bit more, if time allows, on this particular crisis or perhaps opportunity, depending on your perspective, and particularly about the sources that you might have for this and the limits of those sources as you try to address these different perspectives. And then again, if time allows, I'd love to hear more about the title of this paper. When I saw the word mischievous in there, I was really curious and I'd just love to learn a bit more. Secondly then, Ingram's paper. I felt like one of the things I really enjoyed about this paper was how it connected Jay's situation to contemporary issues, particularly issues of trust. I enjoyed the opening story about how the role of the Supreme Court today is kind of under question, specifically public opinion and how it's tied to partisan political agendas. And I also liked how the paper kind of came full circle and closed by considering the 1989 landmark decision that ruled that federal judges could serve on the US Sentencing Commission alongside members of Congress without violating the separation of powers. And I felt like this made perfect sense to me when I learned about degree program. I think the review of the historiography was particularly noteworthy, and I felt like you made a good argument about how your paper goes beyond traditional analysis of Jay. I really like the breadth of scholarship that you quoted, and I think it was impressive how you looked both at scholarship within the academy and beyond, and in the written paper talked about recent media interpretations too. You know, the main body of this paper was really clearly focused on 3 controversial episodes that happened when Jay took on extrajudicial roles whilst he was Chief Justice. And I felt like you did a really good job in the paper at diving into these equally, even given the short amounts of time. Again, like our other papers on the panel, I felt like this particular paper stayed true to the conference theme. And as Ingram notes on quote page 15, quote, Jay's treaty is remembered as one of the most controversial events in the early republic. Further on page 11, and I quote again, Jay's campaign against Clinton exemplified the dirty tone of partisan media which expanded in ugliness on a nationwide scale through the 1790s. And again, this piece of the paper really hooked me and led me to a couple of questions. I wonder if you could expand on this a little bit. You talk a little bit in this section about the media, and I just wondered if you could give me some context on the sources. And again, my second question comes to sources too. I really enjoyed the sections that talked about the letters between Washington and Jay. They were fascinating. And I just wondered how these letters connected to more public-facing sources. And then finally, Irving's paper. The opening just blew me away. I felt like when I was reading about the dreaded yellow fever and the issues with supply of horses and mules, I was immediately immersed in this world of war and crisis. And personally, as someone who is interested in horses and mules in early American history, I was selfishly very fascinated by this reference to horses and mules. You know, in addition to what you raise as the issue with supply of equines, you noted that Pierce was gifted a black horse to use in Mexico. And on the ship, you also noted that the 5 horses that he brought on board ate better than the servants that he also brought too. And really, this is a question for me. You don't need to answer this in the Q&A. You can just email me this. But I just wondered, you know, what records do you have on the horses on board? And if you have any interest in animal history or equine history, I'd love to talk to you about how Roger Williams University is hosting the Equine History Collective Conference this fall, and we have spots for equine military history if you're interested. So coming back to the paper and wrapping my comments up, I felt like the real strength of this paper for me was the range of sources. As I said, I feel like I have newspapers on my mind today, but I really enjoyed the newspaper reports from New Hampshire that provided an insight into popular patriotism at this time, particularly at this time of crisis. In addition to the fascinating assessment of letters between Pierce and Polk, and finally that brief insight from Polk's diary is brilliant. In addition, I really loved how this paper, Irving, addressed some of those big questions that scholars grapple with. In particular, one line from your paper stood out to me when you noted how Pierce was, quote, keen to report the true state of things directly to the president. And again, it really made me wonder about how typical Pierce's interaction or desire for interaction with the president was. And this whole idea of the perception of truth-telling in the historical narrative is something that I think about all the time. So my real question for you, aside from my personal question in equine history, is about the historiography on Pierce. You know, how much do we actually know about this person? Like, what's the state of the field a little bit? And I guess I'm coming from hearing about Jay's situation in the historiography. You know, how does that compare to Pierce? And how do you think your work is going to kind of go up beyond that a little bit? So I want to just say thank you for 3 fabulous papers. I look forward to comments. If you don't have time to answer all of those questions now, that's fine too. They were merely starting points.
Thank you, Professor Carrington Farmer. David, would you like to take about a minute to answer some or all of Professor Carrington Farmer's questions?
Yes. Thank you, Professor, for your comments and for your encouragement. I'll take the second question first when it came to why I entitled it Mischievous. The first is that Burke's pamphlet has such an outsized role in our interpretation of the Jackson Borough Assembly. But I really liked how he kind of winked at the fact that the Assembly's work betrayed a little bit of what the revolution was really about. And so, in a way, I'm kind of looking to kind of leverage that in future research as how is a government viewed as being legitimate? Like, who has the right to dictate that a government is legitimate? That's kind of the question that I'm intrigued by, especially as you kind of alluded to how outsiders viewed it. How does, I mean, especially in today's day where a lot of people claim that a government cannot be legitimate, or this isn't my government, I kind of reinvented that, or kind of go reverse engineering it. So, was this considered order in the eyes of Black Americans? Was this considered order in the form of what women thought about this situation with this reassertion of white male dominance in the South? So that's kind of the dangling hook that I left on the paper at the very end. I don't know if I have time for the second question.
Probably not. Thank you, David. Coda.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you so much for your comments, and absolutely, I think connecting the letters to Washington and Jay to public-facing sources is definitely the next step of this research that I want to look into more. And newspapers are definitely on my mind too. I think that's definitely a running theme. And one thing I hope to gauge from that too is while Washington and Jay had a very close relationship, how was that perceived by the American polity at the time, and how they really connected Jay's character and his reputation to the longevity of the court. So I don't really have too many answers, but I think those questions hopefully will lead me there.
So, and lastly, James.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. One of my advisors does work in animal history, so I think that probably explains the inclusion of the horses in the paper. But in terms of the historiography, there isn't much on Pierce. There have been 2 biographies written in the last 100 years on Pierce, and most of the other scholarship focuses on his presidency and his connection to the fugitive slave law of Kansas, Nebraska. And so the biographies that exist really glorify his time in Mexico as a sort of heroic martial manhood events in his life. And when I started looking into this, saw a lot of fear and a lot of dependence, fear over disease and frustration over logistical issues of moving men across the country, and just totally sort of flipped that narrative that had been presented in these 2 biographies. So it's something to look further into, but also there isn't a lot of historiography out there, so I think this offers the opportunity to do something fairly unique.
Excellent. Thank you, James. We have just over a minute to open up questioning to the room. Anyone, sir, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question for David. I'm interested in, I guess, continuity between the, I guess, last legislature before the disruption and the legislature that feeds in Jacksonboro. How much continuity in membership is there, and to what extent is there evidence that there is continuity, that a lot of the legislation they pass is kind of like pre-planned in correspondence or whatever beforehand?
Great question. Most of the people that served in the reconstituted assembly are almost identical, and that was one of the key areas of struggle that as I expand, I hope to kind of factor in, that there was a huge exclusion of backcountry representatives. Like there were a few token members that were included because of their militia service during the war, or maybe like elites that had at one point lived or had extensive connections in the low country with backcountry. In terms of their legislation that they pursue, a lot of the things that the Jacksonboro Assembly do are more reactionary and less of maintenance, primarily because South Carolina didn't fight very much in the war from 1776 to 1780. They tended to kind of ignore a lot of what was happening in other places, so they tended to kind of be more of a caretaking government rather than reactionary. Thank you for your question. Thank you.
And we should have time for one more question. Sir.
A quick question for Courtland.
Sure.
You alluded to kind of how in the future you want to go into this kind of comparison between the persistence of presidential traditions versus courts. I was wondering if you thought of looking at this through the lens of how easy it is to mythologize these different positions, because George Washington is almost parallel in this mythical sense, and the only president to get rid of his 2 terms is a president who symbolizes on mythical status as comparable. So I'm curious, do you kind of see this perhaps aspect of how mythical is John Jay for justices?
Absolutely. I think especially with Washington, and Washington has been the focus of my master's thesis, and I've been kind of diverting to Washington's circle and filling in his relationships. Also through like a partisan, like party leader sense of Washington's organizing role with the Federalists is kind of the vagueness of the party system. I think one of the clearest differences between creating the judiciary and the executive was during the Constitutional Convention. They really, the framers really designed the presidency around Washington as he was presiding, and he very rarely spoke during the convention. He didn't want to definitively influence the framers during their deliberations, but there were certain signals that he would give. And I think that they designed the presidency with his already mythical status in mind, whereas the judiciary, they also left that in the hands of the president. They let the president nominate who was going to be Chief Justice. One other thing I got to in my paper was looking at the different qualifications that Washington looked to in deciding who should be a justice, including geographic representation and their character, their reputation, that sort of thing. And Jay definitely has not lived up to the mythical status. You Never Forget Your First is something, actually that was a recent book on Washington and women. That's pretty good if you want to check that out from Alexis Coe. But Jay, he's been pretty well forgotten, and it was left more so to John Marshall to set a lot of the precedents for the court with Marbury versus Madison and the rest of his tenure on the court. So I definitely think looking at the myths from the men who filled those positions and how that's definitely established their legacies in how each institution has been shaped. It's a big comparative analysis that I want to dive into further. Thank you for your question.
All right, I'm afraid we have to leave it there. Thank you to our organizers, thank you to our panel, and thank you to Professor Farrington Farmer. And yes, I believe it is lunchtime for everyone. So once again, thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference. See you at I'll be there as to this panel.
I want to go to the restroom again.
Yeah, it's something to talk about. Yeah, but yeah, actually.